Thanks for joining us. Make sure to subscribe to Cheating Stories Best so you don't miss any new tales. Today, we dive into a story that reflects the complexities of marriage, infidelity, and the unexpected twists that can unravel even the most solid unions. Enjoy. The summer sun blazed through the windows, and I was knee-deep in housework, wearing an apron and holding a turkey baster. Cleaning always felt like a losing battle, with dust settling in again almost as soon as I put away my supplies. Just as I was about to pour another glass of sweet tea, the doorbell rang, echoing through the house. I wiped my hands on the apron and peered through the lace curtains. A young man stood on the porch, his figure illuminated by the afternoon light. I opened the door, letting in a rush of hot air. "Can I help you?" I asked. "I'm looking for Sarah Cannon," he replied, his voice filled with urgency. "That's me," I answered, stepping aside to invite him in. "Please, come inside. It's a scorcher out there." As he stepped through the threshold, I motioned toward the seating area. "I'm Sarah Cannon, a family law attorney based here in Atlanta. Nowadays, most of my work revolves around divorce cases. I know that many lawyers find this area of law unappealing, perhaps even unsightly. But I believe that when a marriage ends, good people often suffer, not just emotionally but also financially. If I can help protect someone from that pain, especially a spouse who needs legal and financial support, then I feel like I'm doing something worthwhile." I paused, glancing at him. "I've been at this for quite a while. I won't disclose my age, of course, but I do remember the Kennedy-Nixon debate, if that gives you a hint. If you've managed to stay in law as long as I have, you're either really good or just lucky. Fortunately, I'm neither a millionaire nor a hobbyist." I chuckled softly, knowing my small office was tucked into the first floor of my home near Piedmont Park, a location I cherished since my late husband and I had bought it years ago. After clearing up any confusion about my identity, I led the young man through the French doors into my office, directing him to a cozy sofa. As he settled in, I asked, "How should I address you?" He smiled slightly and replied, "I'm Mr. Stephen Markham." I walked over to a small refrigerator I had built into a closet and said, "Well, Mr. Markham, would you like a glass of sweet iced tea? It's a perfect treat on a hot day, especially paired with one of these sugar cookies I baked this morning." He accepted the tea and cookie, and as I observed him, I noted he was probably around 20 years old. The way he held the plate with his right hand suggested he was left-handed. His hands were clean and well manicured, hinting that whatever his profession was, it didn't involve much physical labor. He was good-looking, not a movie star, but tall and fit. Still, there was an evident tension on his face, a look of deep concern. "So," I began, leaning in slightly, "what brings you here today?" With a heavy heart, he replied, "It's my wife. She wants a divorce." "Just a moment, please," I said softly, sensing the need for another perspective in this conversation. I stepped out of my office and into what used to be the living room, where my assistant, Emily Mayweather, was working on her computer. "Miss Emily," I called, drawing her attention. "I have a potential client in my office. Would you like to join us?" "Yes, ma'am," she replied eagerly, her eyes brightening at the opportunity. As I rose, I couldn't help but admire Emily. She was a lovely young woman, tall and slender, with her brown hair neatly pulled back by a simple ribbon. Her sleeveless summer dress highlighted her graceful femininity. I had hired all my assistants from Agnes Scott College, my alma mater, as they were well-mannered, educated young women. Plus, it felt like a way to give back for the excellent education I had received. While Emily wasn't a lawyer, her sincerity, ambition, and quick wit made her invaluable in the office. I often found her insights helpful, especially since she was closer in age to many of my clients. I was keen to see how she would perceive Stephen as we all sat down together. As we re-entered my office, I noted that Stephen had risen from the couch to greet us. Good manners were becoming a rare trait these days, and I appreciated it. "Mr. Markham," I introduced, "allow me to present my assistant, Miss Emily Mayweather." "Emily, this is Stephen Markham, he's seeking our assistance regarding a possible divorce." Emily nodded respectfully, her demeanor professional yet warm. Once we were all seated, I turned to Stephen and asked him to share the details of his situation. He took a deep breath, and his voice trembled slightly as he began, "My marriage to Lola, my beautiful wife, has hit a rough patch. We married right after college and welcomed our only child, Anita, into our lives. But now, out of nowhere, she's filed for divorce. It feels like a thunderbolt striking out of a clear blue sky." He paused, visibly shaken. "I thought we had a solid marriage. I don't understand what went wrong." The words hung in the air as he recounted the unraveling of his relationship, and I could see the pain etched on his face. This was more than just legal representation, it was a man's heart laid bare, desperately searching for answers. As he continued, I exchanged a glance with Emily. She was listening intently, her expression reflecting empathy and understanding. I could sense we were about to dive into a complex narrative filled with love, betrayal, and the desire for redemption, a story that would test the limits of loyalty and commitment. Markham entered my office with a demeanor that blended apprehension and determination. He had been served with a restraining order preventing him from contacting or coming within 200 yards of his wife and daughter until all legal matters were resolved. As he recounted his story, a sense of familiarity washed over me. After all, my practice often dealt with the aftermath of unhappy marriages. Yet, the mention of the restraining order sent a jolt of concern through me. I didn't expect a polite young man like him to be embroiled in violence. There had to be more to this story, something deeper lurking beneath the surface. Once he finished, I leaned forward, my interest piqued. "Mr. Markham," I began, "I need to be upfront with you. Most of my clients are women. Typically, they initiate the divorce, and my role is to ensure they get what they deserve. I'm not making any assumptions about your situation, but this case falls outside my usual practice. I'll need some time to decide if I can represent you." I stood, signaling the end of our meeting. Markham rose as well, but his expression reflected surprise and disappointment. I thought lawyers just took on clients as they came," he said, his voice trailing off. "Some do," I replied, a bit sternly, "but I'm not one of those lawyers." He paused and then smiled, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "I've heard you're the toughest, I mean the best divorce lawyer in town. So, I'll take the risk and come back tomorrow." "Good. But be sure to bring a copy of the restraining order with you. I'll need to see it if I decide to take your case." He blushed, realizing he hadn't brought the necessary documents today. After shaking my hand, he wished me a good day and walked out, leaving me to contemplate his situation. Turning to my assistant, Emily, I raised an eyebrow. "Well, what do you think of our visitor?" Without missing a beat, she replied, "He doesn't seem like the kind of man who would force his wife to seek a divorce. He seems good-natured and well-mannered. And," she added with a hint of excitement, "he's handsome too." A blush crept across her cheeks as she looked down. "He is attractive," I agreed, trying to temper her enthusiasm. But when a wife suddenly seeks a divorce, there's usually a solid reason behind it. And when a restraining order is involved, that raises red flags. Before you get too carried away, I'd like you to do some research online. See if you can uncover anything about Mr. Markham that might shed light on his situation. I need it this afternoon so we can discuss it together." Emily nodded eagerly. "Yes, Mrs. Cannon." She hurried to her computer, ready to dig into the details. As she left, I tidied up the remnants of our meeting, half-eaten sugar cookies and leftover tea. I found myself pondering the reality of the legal profession. Markham was right about one thing: most lawyers have little choice in their clients. Many had to scramble like desperate birds pecking for crumbs, while others resorted to garish advertising to attract business. But I had been fortunate, honing my skills and reputation to the point where I could choose the cases I wanted to take on. If I played my cards right, I might be able to bring some measure of justice to this tumultuous world. Amen to that, I muttered to myself as I returned to my desk. A couple of hours later, as I reviewed another case, a gentle knock interrupted my thoughts. Emily peeked her head inside. "Can I come in, Mrs. Cannon? I found some information about Mr. Markham." "Of course," I said, waving her in. She settled into the chair across from me, adjusting her skirt nervously. A thick stack of papers filled her hands, a testament to her diligence. "Here's what I found," she began, arranging her documents into organized piles. He was born in Nashville but moved to the Atlanta area as a child. He graduated from Emory University about 6 years ago, majoring in art, so he's only a few years older than me. He's an artist, and his work is starting to gain local attention. While he hasn't had any major sales, his latest exhibition at Centennial Park received positive reviews from a critic for the journal Constitution. I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Interesting. He's married, at least for now, to Lola Markham, formerly Lola Martinez from Miami Beach. They met in college and tied the knot right after graduation. They have a 3-year-old daughter named Anita," Emily continued, her excitement bubbling over. "I even saw a picture of her, she's adorable." "What else did you uncover?" I asked, leaning forward, eager for more details. Emily flipped to another page, her eyes scanning the text. "He has no arrests, no complaints, and no warrants, nothing. Not even a traffic ticket. Before the restraining order, the police had no record of him at all." "Very good," I said, impressed with her thoroughness. "Now, what can you tell me about Mrs. Markham?" Emily retrieved another stack of papers, this one seemingly more formal. "She's the vice president and senior account manager for a marketing firm here in Atlanta," she said, glancing up to meet my gaze. "It seems she's quite successful." "Interesting," I mused, tapping my fingers on the desk. "A power couple, then. But what about their marriage? If things were so good, why is she seeking a restraining order?" Emily continued her research, poring over the details, trying to connect the dots between Markham's polished exterior and the hidden turmoil that could lie beneath. As the afternoon wore on, the tension in the air grew palpable. There was clearly more to this story than met the eye, and I had to prepare myself for whatever revelations might come to light. The Atlanta office of Hamilton Johnson, the largest publicly traded PR firm in the country, buzzed with energy as employees juggled calls and clients. Among them was Lola Markham, a star player in the agency who had started as an intern while in college and quickly climbed the ranks to become a key account manager. She was known for her charm, her ability to secure high-profile clients, and her impeccable style. The office gossip was rife with speculation about her success and her glamorous lifestyle. One afternoon, Emily, one of my junior associates, handed me a newspaper clipping showcasing Lola in all her glory. "Check out this photo," she said, her eyes wide with admiration. I looked down at the picture and couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. "Back in my day, we would have called her an intimate bomb," I remarked, unable to ignore the striking image before me. Lola's curly dark hair cascaded below her shoulders, framing a face that was both beautiful and commanding, even in her sharp corporate suit. "She's very beautiful," I noted, my voice light. Emily huffed, clearly unimpressed. "If you like that type," she muttered. "Come on, what do you really know about her life outside of work?" I asked, teasingly. She pulled out a stack of printouts that looked like they had been pulled straight from Lola's Facebook page. "Here's the thing," Emily began, flipping through the pages. "There's a long list of memberships and activities, and these photos show her at various parties and charity events. It's hard to say where her work ends and her personal life begins." She paused, her expression shifting. "I find it interesting that there are no pictures of Stephen or their daughter on her page." "Let's not jump to conclusions just yet, honey," I cautioned, sensing Emily's mounting skepticism. This could all be work-related or a desire to keep her personal life private. "Well, maybe," Emily replied, "but if I had a husband as sweet and talented as he seems, I would want to show him off. And her daughter, too." She blushed slightly, hastily adding, "Not that I'm saying you like him or anything. Just don't let that admiration cloud your judgment," I advised, watching as she avoided my gaze. "But I have to admit, Mr. Markham does seem like an unlikely candidate for infidelity, and it's even less likely that he would pose a physical threat to Lola or their daughter. This makes me think there's more to the story than we've heard so far. Maybe I'll take his case after all," I mused, intrigued by the complexities of the situation. The next day, as fate would have it, Stephen Markham knocked on the door of my office, a historic house that had been converted into a professional space. "Come in, darling. It's too hot to stand outside," I called, ushering him into the cool hallway. As we entered my office, I noticed Emily was already seated, her hands demurely folded in her lap. She looked up with a bright smile. "Nice to see you again, Mr. Markham." "My pleasure, Miss Emily," he replied, returning her smile, and I could see the warmth of recognition between them. "Let's get started," I said, taking a seat across from him on the plush couch. "As I mentioned yesterday, I usually represent women in family disputes, but Emily and I found some points in your case that piqued our curiosity. Therefore, I think I will make an exception and represent you, Mr. Markham, if that's still what you want." A look of relief washed over Stephen's face, and he began to express his gratitude. "Don't thank me just yet, young man," I interrupted, raising a hand. "I haven't done anything to deserve your gratitude. Let's wait until I actually accomplish something useful." He nodded, understanding, but I could see how relieved he was that I had agreed to take his case. "Now that I've decided to represent you," I continued, "I would like your permission to call you Stephen." He nodded quickly, a slight smile breaking across his face. "Of course, and you can call me Sarah." "Thank you, Miss Sarah," he replied politely. "Now, Stephen, the first thing I need to do is review the documents you received, including the restraining order," I said, leaning forward in my seat. He fished out a stack of legal papers from the inside pocket of his summer suit and handed them to me. As I scanned the documents, it quickly became clear that the divorce petition was a standard template, as if it had been copied straight from a law textbook. The restraining order was equally mundane, so I moved on to the property division offer. Well, I remarked, raising an eyebrow. "It seems Mrs. Markham wants your house and everything in it. She also wants primary custody of your daughter and child support. It looks like she's trying to take everything she can." Stephen's face darkened with sadness and confusion, emotions I had seen on him yesterday. "If she takes all this, it will practically ruin me," he lamented, his voice trembling. "I won't have a place to live or paint, and I'll practically lose Anita." His head dropped in disbelief. "I just don't understand why she's become so cruel to me. I've always treated her with love." Emily, who had been silently observing, reached out to stroke his hand gently. Now, Stephen. Nothing has been decided yet. In chess, this would just be the opening move. The game is far from over," I encouraged him. "But there's one thing that still troubles me," I pressed. "What did you do to make your wife seek police protection? What led to this restraining order?" Stephen blushed, this time from anger rather than shame. "It was bloody weird," he exclaimed, throwing his hands up in exasperation. "I was meeting with Roger Evie, my agent, to discuss some paintings I was hoping to sell. As we were talking, some guy I'd never seen before came up to me and asked if I was Stephen Markham. When I confirmed, he handed me some documents and told me I'd received a lawsuit. When I opened them and saw it was a divorce lawsuit from Lola, I was stunned." "Of course," I urged him. "What happened next?" "Well, I cut short my meeting with Roger and rushed home to find out what was going on," Stephen continued, his voice rising with emotion. "But when I got there, the door was locked, and my key wouldn't fit. I started knocking on the door. The tension in the room was palpable as I leaned forward, eager to hear the rest of his story, sensing that the deeper truth of the Markhams' marriage was just beginning to unravel. Lola stood inside the house, her presence palpable even if she didn't open the door. I shouted for her, my voice echoing against the walls, but all she said was that I couldn't come in and I had to let the court sort it out. Stephen stood there, glancing back and forth between us, helpless. I couldn't believe I was being kept out of my own home. The thought of Anita hit me hard, and I demanded to know where she was. "You can't see her until this is all over," Lola replied, her tone dismissive. Frustration surged through me, and before I could think, I began pounding on the door, threatening to break it down. In an instant, a police officer appeared, grabbing my arm and yanking me away from the entrance. "If you don't leave right now, I'm going to have to arrest you," he warned. Anger boiled inside me, but I had been raised to respect the law. The last thing I wanted was to end up in handcuffs, so I turned and stormed off to my brother's house instead. The next day, I received a restraining order from the court. "What did you do after that?" I nudged Stephen, curious about what had transpired. "Well," he began, his voice shaky, "I talked to my brother. He told me I needed a lawyer, and fast. When I mentioned I didn't know any, he suggested the best divorce attorney in the city. He said I should go to you, Sarah." I couldn't help but smile at the compliment. "I guess I should bake some peach cobbler to thank your brother for the recommendation," I said, setting aside the legal papers in front of me. "Before we can do anything, I need more information to work with," I continued, glancing at Emily. "Emily, I need you to take Stephen to your office and get everything you can from him. I want to hear his life story, details about his family, friends, and acquaintances. Can you do that?" "What exactly are you looking for, Miss Sarah?" Emily asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. "I can't say for sure, but I'll know it when I see it," I explained. Emily didn't look completely convinced, but I could see the determination in her eyes. "After you've gathered that information, Stephen, I want you to tell Emily everything you know about Lola, her business, her hobbies, her social circle, everything. Don't worry if you forget some details, Emily is excellent at finding information online. If you work together, I'm sure you'll uncover what we need. So get to work, you two, and stick with it no matter how long it takes. The longer this drags on, the longer it will be before you can reunite with Anita." They seemed to grasp the urgency of the situation, exchanging determined glances. "We'll do it," Emily said with a shy smile, taking Stephen's hand and leading him into her office. As the two walked through the French doors, already deep in conversation, I couldn't help but reflect on the chaos that had unfolded when Stephen was served with those divorce papers and then the restraining order. One thing was certain, Lola Markham was a master event planner. She orchestrated that ambush on Stephen with precision, from the process server to the locksmith to the police officer who happened to be nearby when Stephen returned home. She must have even arranged for her lawyer to file for the restraining order. I made a mental note to never underestimate her. The more I thought about it, the more I realized Lola didn't genuinely fear for her safety when she requested that order. Damn it, Stephen is a gentleman, I mused. He would never lay a hand on a woman, not under any circumstances. Lola knows that better than anyone. If she didn't need protection from him, then why did she pursue the restraining order? It hit me, she wanted to expedite the divorce. What better way to push Stephen to settle than to make it as difficult as possible for him to see Anita? Clever girl, Lola, I thought. Another detail about the divorce suit piqued my curiosity. She had chosen Bo Willingham of one of the largest law firms in Atlanta to represent her. That was intriguing, but I wondered why. Bo Willingham specialized in corporate law, and I'd be surprised if they even had a family law specialist. I looked through the legal directory to find the name of the attorney who signed the lawsuit. That's when I discovered Harold Jenkins, a young associate who had only been with the firm for 3 years. His specialty? Mergers and acquisitions. It was clear to me that the firm had dumped her case on a rookie attorney in hopes of impressing the partners. I thought, Lola must have knocked on a lot of doors to get Beau Willingham to take her case. What's her game plan? Perhaps she believed that the clout of such a powerful firm would force Stephen to submit to her demands. With Harold's name and number in hand, I decided to call him. "Mr. Jenkins," I said when he answered, "I'd like to request a preliminary meeting to discuss the terms of the divorce." "Of course," he replied politely. "My schedule is pretty packed, but I believe I can fit you in early next week." "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Jenkins. I look forward to our meeting," I said before hanging up. Over the next few days, I watched as Stephen and Emily worked diligently on their assignment. Every time I passed Emily's office, I saw them leaning toward each other, deep in conversation about something crucial. Emily typed queries into her computer while Stephen leaned closer to see what she uncovered. Twice, their research extended beyond regular office hours, and they even went out for a bite to eat together before returning for another round of work. I chuckled to myself, teasing them. "Are you sure you are not writing a biography on Stephen?" "Oh no," Emily replied, her cheeks turning a shade of pink. She seemed to be blushing more often around him, which made me smile. "But you said that every little detail could be important, so I'm trying to find out as much about him as I can." "I'm sure you're doing great, honey. Just keep up the good work," I encouraged her. On the day of my meeting with Harold Jenkins, I drove to their office on Peachtree Street. The firm occupied a prestigious building that towered above the bustling city, a testament to the powerful legal team housed within its walls. As I stepped out of my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a long, complicated battle. But I was ready. For Stephen, for Anita, and for the truth that needed to come out. The elevator ride to the top 4 floors of the 35-story tower felt like an eternity. As the doors finally opened, I was greeted by a pleasant receptionist who ushered me into a spacious conference room. The walls were adorned with wood and metal, and the room was large enough to comfortably seat 20 people. I felt small and insignificant in such a vast space, and I couldn't help but think that this was exactly the impression they intended to create. "Would you like a Coca-Cola, honey?" she asked with a warm smile. "No, thank you," I replied. "I'll just wait for Mr. Jenkins." I assumed Jenkins would keep me waiting for at least 15 minutes, but to my surprise, he arrived after just 10. He seemed a bit nervous, dressed in a typical lawyer's suit with gray stripes, a crisp white shirt, and a discreet striped tie. Despite his youth, I noticed his hair was already thinning, and his waist appeared to be expanding, the buttons on his shirt straining against the fabric. "Mrs. Cannon," he said with enthusiasm, extending his hand. "I haven't had the pleasure of meeting you in person yet, but I've heard wonderful things about you." "How flattering," I replied, smiling back. "It's a pleasure to meet you too, Mr. Jenkins." He took his seat at the head of the table, adjusting his papers with a sense of urgency. "Now, let's see if we can sort out the details of the property division so these two can move on with their lives." "Would you mind if I knit?" I asked, retrieving my bag from my lap. Jenkins looked taken aback by my question, so I added, "I find that knitting helps me concentrate." No, of course I don't mind. Please, go ahead," he said, a hint of amusement creeping into his tone. Ignoring the smirk, I pulled out my knitting needles and a ball of yarn, settling into the rhythmic motion of knitting as he shifted in his chair, clearly trying to regain control of the meeting. "So, about the division of property, Mrs. Cannon," Jenkins began, but I interrupted him. "Yes, regarding the separation proposal, my client was quite surprised by the terms proposed by your client. They seem a bit one-sided." "Oh no," he responded quickly, a defensive edge to his voice. "We don't think it's unreasonable. Take the custody agreement, for example. It's not uncommon for a court to award custody to a mother when the child is very young, especially if it's a girl. Yes, I understand that, I replied, but my client is saddened by the proposed restrictions on his visitation. He misses his daughter deeply and would like to see her more often than just a few weekends and a 2-week vacation each year. And now, with the restraining order against him, he can't see her at all. Of course, Jenkins said, his tone shifting to one of feigned empathy. I'm sure the separation is very painful for him. The sooner we settle this, the sooner we can lift the restraining order and return the dear child to her father's arms. He gave me what I perceived as a sycophantic smile, and I thought, this is going to cost you. Getting her back is my client's highest priority, I said, affirming my stance. Great, Jenkins exclaimed, as if the custody issue had already been resolved. Now, let's move on to the division of property. I nodded, wanting to get straight to the point. What about the division of property? Does my client really have to lose not only his house but everything in it? Not at all, Mrs. Cannon, he said, smiling as if making a grand concession. He can keep his clothes, shaving supplies, and other personal effects. But what about the furniture and kitchen utensils? Doesn't Lola expect Stephen to start over with nothing? I pressed. Jenkins shook his head, his expression serious. Mrs. Markham is a woman of taste and sophistication. She has invested significant time and effort into decorating their home to reflect her own style. Given the substantial difference in their incomes, you must admit that she contributed most of the funds for this. I remained silent, contemplating his words as he continued. Under these circumstances, she understandably does not want her hard work to be, well, plundered by an offended husband. Really? I interjected, my skepticism evident. She can't claim ownership of the paintings in his studio. I believe she hasn't even hung any of his work in the house. Can't she allow him to keep his own art? I must remind you, Mrs. Cannon, that it was my client who set up and financed Mr. Ayer's little studio, he explained, noticing my curious expression. You know about his art studio? I graduated from Agnes Scott College, Mr. Jenkins. I know what a studio is, I replied, barely suppressing my annoyance. And unlike you, I know how to pronounce it correctly. Of course, he hurriedly continued. To be honest, Mrs. Cannon, after the unfortunate incident where Mr. Markham became aggressive at their home and had to be restrained by the police, Mrs. Markham is extremely reluctant to concede any property for which she has paid, except for what we've already discussed. Interesting, I thought, realizing he had anticipated the question of ownership regarding the paintings and had prepared a carefully crafted response. Mrs. Cannon, I urge you to impress upon your client that this entire unfortunate matter can be resolved, and access to his daughter quickly restored if you simply sign the offer we've presented. Dragging out these negotiations will only cause more delays, and I highly doubt they will change the outcome. Feeling the tension rising, I put my knitting away and stood up. Okay, Mr. Jenkins. I will convey your position directly to my client. I believe we can all meet again soon for a final resolution. Very well, Mrs. Cannon. The sooner, the better, he replied, standing up as well. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have another appointment. With that, Jenkins left the room, a triumphant smile barely concealed on his face. I walked out alone, remembering to thank the receptionist for her kindness. When I returned to my office, Stephen and Emily were eagerly waiting to hear how the meeting had gone. I invited them in to discuss the proceedings, feeling the weight of the situation bearing down on all of us. What transpired after my meeting with Mr. Jenkins left an impression on both young men in my office. As I recounted the details, I noticed their expressions shift to a somber hue. I think the whole meeting was a waste of time, Emily lamented. I shook my head, determined to find the silver lining. On the contrary, my dear, I replied, a smile creeping onto my face. I actually learned 3 things today that could prove to be invaluable for us. Stephen raised an eyebrow, puzzled. Really, Miss Sarah? What are these revelations? I leaned forward, lowering my voice slightly as if sharing a secret. The first thing I confirmed is that your wife is using your daughter to apply pressure on you, pushing you to make hasty decisions on her terms. Mr. Jenkins made it abundantly clear how much leverage Lola has over you regarding this. Stephen's face darkened as the realization sunk in. The second revelation, I continued, is that your wife insists on preserving everything in your home, particularly your paintings. But why? Stephen erupted, frustration evident in his tone. They're not worth much, and she hasn't shown any interest in my work for years. That's a very interesting question, Stephen, I replied thoughtfully. I'd love to find out the answer as well. As I fell silent, Emily, eager to contribute, chimed in. You mentioned learning 3 things, Mrs. Sarah. What's the third? I straightened up, crossing my arms with a firm stance. The last thing I discovered is that Mr. Richard Jenkins is neither a particularly skilled lawyer nor a gentleman. I'll have to ask for forgiveness for some of the less than charitable thoughts I had about him today. I smiled at them both, trying to lighten the mood. Now that I've shared what I learned from Mr. Jenkins, would you like to share what you found out about Mr. Markham and his wife? Emily dashed to grab her growing stack of notes and printouts, and they settled side by side on the sofa to report their findings. After a brief discussion, Emily began her presentation with a summary of Stephen's family background and early life. Stephen took the reins to recount how he met and ultimately married Lola Martinez. As they spoke, I couldn't help but find their camaraderie amusing. They often finished each other's sentences, eager to showcase their discoveries. Very good, I praised them. But have you learned anything else about Mrs. Markham? Their duet shifted to a more somber tone as they began to delve into Lola's life and career. It was clear neither of them enjoyed this topic, but their discomfort couldn't overshadow the fact that Lola Markham was indeed an impressive young woman. During her time at university, Emily began, her voice tentative but gaining confidence. She was active in service organizations, served as president of her sorority, and graduated in the top 10% of her class. I nodded, impressed. She started working full-time at Hamilton Johnson and climbed the ladder from an entry-level assistant to vice president and senior account representative in record time, Stephen added. That's quicker than most employees take to learn the office layout. That's an astonishing rise in the company, I noted, raising an eyebrow. Even you have to admit, Stephen, she must be exceptionally talented to achieve that. Emily, reluctantly acknowledging the facts, said, the number of large accounts she manages is quite astonishing. Do you know who they are? I asked, intrigued. Oh yes. She replied, rifling through her notes. There are several major Atlanta companies, institutions, and organizations on her list. Sorry to interrupt, I interjected, but did you just mention Avery International? Is that the company owned by Roger Avery, the famed agent? That's right, Stephen confirmed, his eyes lighting up. Actually, it was Lola who introduced me to Roger. It was an honor to work with such a renowned agent. Emily chimed in, and here's another connection, Mrs. Sarah. Lola also does public relations for Bourne Willingham. What a small world, I exclaimed, surprised. But isn't it somewhat unusual for a law firm to hire a PR agency? As they continued sharing their insights, my mind drifted, processing everything I had learned. I was building numerous scenarios in my head, but none solid enough to act upon just yet. I realized I needed additional help if we were going to make any real progress. Seeing that the 2 young men were eager to continue their presentation late into the night, I decided to interject. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think it's time for me to reach out to an old friend. I need to get this done before it's too late. Perhaps you two should wrap up for today, and we can continue tomorrow morning. As they left my office, I began rummaging through my desk drawers. Where did I put that church directory? I mumbled to myself. The following morning, when Emily and Stephen walked into my office, They were surprised to see me engaged in conversation with an older African-American man they had never met before. I quickly rose to introduce them. "Mr. Rayford," I said, gesturing toward the young people, "may I introduce my assistant, Miss Emily Mayweather?" Emily nodded politely, albeit with a hint of hesitance. "And here, standing next to her, is Mr. Stephen Markham, the client I mentioned." "Hello," Mr. Rayford greeted, his tone warm and welcoming. "Emily, Stephen," I continued, "allow me to introduce Mr. Lucius Rayford. He's the gentleman who cleans my office." Emily and Stephen exchanged glances, trying to mask their surprise. "Lucius and his wife, Mabel, are dear friends of mine," I explained. "We go to the same church, and he agreed to help us." Taking Mr. Rayford's arm, I said, "Thank you so much, Lucius. It's reassuring to know we can count on you." "Oh, Mrs. Sarah," he replied with a gentle smile, "you know I'd do anything for you." Turning to Emily and Stephen, he nodded slightly and said, "Nice to meet you," before heading for the door. "Please give my best to Mrs. Rayford," I called after him. "I will, I promise," he assured me, leaving a bit hesitantly. Once he was gone, Emily turned to me, her curiosity evident. "Mrs. Sarah, how can Mr. Rayford help us?" I smiled knowingly. "I've been friends with Lucius for a long time. You'd be surprised what he can do. But for now, we need to be patient." "And what exactly are we waiting for?" Emily inquired, her brow furrowing. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing with possibilities. "We're waiting for the right moment to act," I replied. "Patience is key, and in our line of work, it's crucial to know when to strike." As I looked at my young companions, I could sense the tension in the air. The stakes were high, and with every passing day, the complexity of the situation deepened. Together, we would navigate this treacherous terrain, seeking the truth hidden beneath the surface. Emily looked at me, a hint of uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "So, what do you think? Do you have a plan?" I smiled reassuringly. "I'm not entirely sure yet, but I guess I'll know when I see it. In the meantime, I want you to keep digging. See if you missed anything or can spot any other connections." Stephen glanced at Emily, a furrow forming on his brow. "I like working with Emily," he admitted, "but I'm starting to worry about Anita. When do you think I'll be able to see her again?" I felt a pang of sympathy for him, knowing how difficult the waiting could be. "Everything is in the Lord's time," I said softly, hoping to offer some comfort. As fate would have it, the Lord's time came just 3 weeks later. On that particular afternoon, Mr. Rayford entered my office with a large envelope in hand. I had just finished reviewing its contents when Stephen and Emily walked in. Well, I said, a frown crossing my face as I took in the envelope's contents. I wouldn't have expected to see something like this, especially so quickly. "Yes, Mrs. Sarah, it's quite remarkable," Rayford agreed, his voice filled with a sense of urgency. I leaned across the table, pulling him in for a quick hug and kissing his cheek. "Thank you for everything, dear. You've really helped us a lot. I should invite you and Mabel over for dinner soon," I added. "That would be wonderful, Mrs. Sarah," he replied, his smile wide and genuine. "We're looking forward to it." After he left, I turned to Stephen and Emily, a smile spreading across my face. "I think we're almost ready for the final stage." Just as I said this, the phone on my desk rang. I recognized the number immediately and signaled for Emily and Stephen to stay put as I answered. "Yes, this is Mrs. Cannon. Of course, I'd be happy to wait for Mr. Jenkins." A minute passed, then 2, before I heard his voice again. "Hello, Mrs. Cannon. How nice to hear from you. I had the opportunity to discuss your client's proposal with Mr. Markham. I believe we're at a point where we can reach a mutually acceptable agreement. Why don't we meet at your office at a time that suits us all?" I glanced at Stephen and Emily, raising my eyebrows to ensure they were free. "Yes, "Tomorrow at 3 p.m. works for me," I replied. "It would be nice to see you." As I hung up, I turned to Emily and Stephen, trying to quell the rising tension. As the great Caesar said, the die is cast. "Now, before our meeting, I need to know if you found any other information that could change our case." They exchanged confused glances, their body language reminiscent of nervous schoolchildren unsure of their answers. Finally, Emily spoke up. "Mrs. Sarah, we spent hours going over everything, but all we could find was one minor coincidence. It didn't seem significant." "What is it?" I prompted. She hesitated, her brow furrowing. "We noticed that Beau Willingham and Hamilton Johnson have offices in the same building, but I don't see how that matters." I smiled at Emily. "It's okay, honey. You and Stephen did a great job. In fact, Mr. Rayford mentioned the same coincidence." Emily fell silent, but Stephen wasn't as hesitant. "What does it matter, Mrs. Sarah? It just makes it easier for Lola to visit her lawyer when she needs legal help." "You're absolutely right, Stephen. But you have to admit that there are too many coincidences in this case. Now, if you'll excuse me, it's late, and I have a lot of work to do before tomorrow. Why don't you two go grab something to eat? We'll meet at Peachtree Street together tomorrow." I wasn't exaggerating when I said I had a lot of work to do. I worked late into the night and well into the next morning, making sure everything was precisely how I wanted it. By the time the meeting rolled around, I was tired but satisfied with our progress. As the three of us walked to the offices of Beau Willingham and Hamilton Johnson, silence hung heavy in the air. The oppressive heat outside mingled with our nerves, and small talk felt unnecessary. We were once again ushered into the sterile, expansive conference room where I had met Mr. Jenkins previously. Waiting in silence became the norm, and this time we waited a full 20 minutes. He must be feeling quite confident today, I thought to myself, glancing at my watch. Finally, Mr. Jenkins made his entrance, apologizing for his tardiness in a way that felt insincere. "I'm very sorry for keeping you waiting," he began, his tone lacking genuine remorse. "No need to apologize, Mr. Jenkins," I replied with a slight smile. "We all know what an important person you are." Jenkins lifted his head, momentarily unsure whether I was being sarcastic or sincere. At that moment, a soft knock on the door interrupted us. Jenkins quickly opened it, allowing a young woman to step inside. "Mrs. Cannon," he announced with a flourish, "I don't believe you've met Lola Martinez Markham yet." I felt Stephen tense beside me at the sight of his estranged wife. It won't take him long to forget her, I mused silently. Leaning across the table, I extended my hand. "Hello, Mrs. Markham. It's unfortunate that the circumstances of our meeting are so somber." She returned my greeting with a polite smile, sitting down and crossing her legs. The hem of her short skirt rode up, revealing more of her thigh than I deemed appropriate. Clad in a men's shirt with just enough buttons undone to showcase her ample cleavage, she seemed to have dressed deliberately to remind Stephen of what he was missing. After I introduced Stephen and Emily, Jenkins wasted no time in attempting to take control of the meeting, just like he had last time. But first, he turned to me with a patronizing grin. "I see you've brought your bag with you again, Mrs. Cannon. Will you be knitting again?" I smiled sweetly back at him, letting my annoyance simmer beneath the surface. "No, I need my bag for other things today." Having completed these pleasantries, Jenkins spread his hands in a theatrical gesture. "I'd like to begin our meeting by reviewing the proposal my client has made." "Sorry," I interrupted, I said, feeling a surge of confidence. I was ready to steer this meeting in the right direction. "I'd like to kick off our negotiations by reviewing our counterproposal," I said, my voice steady and firm. The room fell silent, and Jenkins looked momentarily stunned, his expression shifting quickly to one of composure. "Oh, of course, Mrs. Cannon," he stammered. "Ladies first. We had no idea you had an alternative offer. We'd love to hear what you have." Lola shot him an incredulous glare. "I don't think she's on board with this," she spat, crossing her arms defiantly. But I ignored their little exchange and pressed on. "Regarding the house that Mr. and Mrs. Markham shared, our proposal is that Mrs. Markham vacate immediately, relinquishing all claims to it in favor of Mr. Markham." "What?" Lola screamed, her voice piercing through the tension in the air. She turned to Jenkins, her eyes wide with disbelief. "She can't do this." Jenkins quickly placed a hand on hers, trying to calm her down, then turned to me, indignation etched across his face. "Mrs. Cannon, what makes you think Mrs. Markham would ever agree to such an outrageous proposal?" I let his words wash over me and directed my attention straight to Lola. "Mrs. Markham, you are truly an impressive young woman. In just 3 years, you've achieved the kind of prestige in your field that most people strive for their entire careers. You obviously possess the beauty, brains, and talent to have made it this far." Although she was clearly still irritated by my proposal, I could see that my compliments had piqued her interest, just a little. Little daffodil, I thought, noting her reaction. "However," I continued, "even with such remarkable qualities, I believe it would be difficult for anyone to achieve so much in such a short time without using certain other talents." I reached into my bag and pulled out a photograph, handing it to her face down. When she turned it over, her expression changed. "Where did you get this?" she shouted, the shock evident in her voice. Jenkins quickly snatched the photo from her hands, his eyes widening in disbelief as he realized what he was looking at. The black and white image depicted a rather explicit scene involving none other than Mrs. Stephen Markham. Emily gasped when I handed her the duplicates, her face paling. She leaned in close to Stephen, speaking urgently to keep him from erupting. But Jenkins, unable to contain himself, blurted out, "Who the hell is this?" "This," I said coolly, "is Mr. Warren Lewison, the managing director of the Atlanta office of Hamilton Johnson. I assume, Mrs. Markham, that he is your boss." As Jenkins continued to stare at the photograph, dumbfounded, I added, "It seems your client hasn't been entirely forthcoming about her reasons for seeking a divorce." Lola opened her mouth to protest, but Jenkins, to his credit, regained his composure and shot her a steely glare, effectively silencing her. "While this photo seems to depict a small office romance, it's unfortunately unrelated to the matter at hand," Jenkins asserted, regaining his confidence. "The state of Georgia has a no-fault divorce law that doesn't consider the reasons for divorce. Any alleged infidelity would be irrelevant in court." "True enough, Mr. Jenkins," I replied, keeping my tone measured. "But if you and Mrs. Markham take a closer look at the setting, you'll notice this took place in the offices of Hamilton Johnson, in this very building. I believe that if the existence of this relationship became known to the directors and shareholders, they would not be forgiving." Jenkins's face turned a shade paler. "First of all, what they're doing is a clear violation of the corporation's code of ethics, which prohibits any such relationships between a manager and a subordinate. Secondly, they may draw some unpleasant conclusions about the real reason for Mrs. Markham's rapid rise through the ranks." As my words settled over the unfortunate pair before me, I offered them a way out. "However, I see no need for anyone else to see this photograph or consider its implications if we can all agree to our proposal regarding the Markham house." Jenkins and Lola immediately began to whisper among themselves, the tone of their conversation tense and urgent. I glanced over at Stephen and Emily, who were both visibly shaken. Emily's expression was one of shock, but she quickly composed herself and focused on soothing Stephen, who looked as if he was grappling with a storm of pain and anger. I doubted she'd be eager to add Lola Markham as a friend on Facebook anytime soon. "Stephen," I said softly, trying to catch his eye. "I know this is difficult, but we're working towards a resolution." Turning back to Jenkins and Lola, I cleared my throat to draw their attention back to the table. "Now, let's move on to our second counter-proposal, which concerns custody of their daughter, Anita. We propose that Stephen Markham be granted full custody, with limited visitation rights for Lola, only at the discretion of the father. Lola and Jenkins were visibly taken aback. Jenkins couldn't contain himself, exclaiming, "Mrs. Cannon, this is impossible. No court would ever grant sole custody to a father if the mother weren't behind bars. This is absurd." "Funny you should mention that, Mr. Jenkins," I replied calmly, unfazed by his outburst. "Perhaps you would be so kind as to take another look at this letter." I retrieved copies of the document from my bag and distributed them to everyone at the table. The letter was written on the letterhead of a major art dealer in New York and addressed to Mr. Roger Avery. The essence of the letter was an offer from the New York dealer to purchase several works by Rich Markham for an extremely large sum. As Jenkins read through the letter, I could see the realization dawning on his face. It wasn't just about the custody battle anymore, it was about the implications of the entire situation, the stakes rising higher than anyone had anticipated. Bewilderment, I thought as I glanced at the table piled high with papers and evidence. "I don't see how this relates to our discussion this afternoon," Jenkins said, irritation creeping into his tone. Before I could respond, Stephen burst out, "Wait a minute. This letter is dated over a month ago. Avery never mentioned anything about this deal. I had no clue about any sale of my paintings." "Exactly, Stephen," I chimed in, sensing the tension in the air. "You didn't know about this, but I suspect Mr. Avery may have shared this information with your wife." Lola refused to meet my gaze, her eyes darting away as I pressed further, wondering why she was so adamant about holding on to the pictures of Stephen when she had never shown much interest in them before. The letter offered a possible explanation. "Let me take the lead here," Jenkins interjected, clearly flustered. "This is slander. You're making baseless accusations. You have no proof that my client was aware of this letter. For all we know, Avery could have lost the offer or simply forgotten about it." Jenkins continued, "Besides, Avery wouldn't have benefited from any collusion, he would have been paid his commissions from the sale of the paintings regardless of who owned them." "I was thinking the same thing, Mr. Jenkins," I replied calmly, reaching into my bag for another set of photographs. As I passed them around the room, silence fell like a heavy curtain. Everyone stared at the images, revealing L. Markham's latest escapade. "That's Roger Avery," Stephen whispered, confirming what everyone else either knew or suspected. I waited for the commotion to settle before I spoke again, turning my attention to Lola. "Conspiracy to defraud is a serious criminal offense, my dear. If I present this letter and these photographs to the authorities, I'm confident they won't hesitate to press charges." "No," she screamed, her voice rising in panic. "You can't prove anything. You can't do this to me." A sly smile crossed my face. "As it turns out, I'm having dinner next week with the State Attorney General, an old friend of mine. Would you like me to bring this to his attention?" Jenkins turned to Lola, his face a mask of desperation. "Just shut up. You're only making things worse for yourself." Once her protests faded, I seized the moment of silence. My client and I don't want his daughter to feel the shame of having a convicted felon as a mother. If we can agree on our proposed custody arrangement, with full child support from Lola, of course, I believe we can avoid the pain of an investigation, trial, and a likely guilty verdict." I looked directly at Jenkins, adding, "Would you agree that the court is more likely to grant the father's primary custody request if he has the mother's written consent?" Jenkins could no longer meet my gaze. With a defeated tone, he muttered, "I'm sure that will be perfectly acceptable, Mrs. Cannon." "Well, if we've agreed on our two counter-proposals, there's only one last point left," I continued cheerfully. "Oh God, what now?" Jenkins groaned, clearly exasperated. I frowned at his blasphemy but chose to ignore it and press on. "The last item to discuss is the bill for the time my firm has spent on this case. Given the circumstances that led my client to seek legal advice, we believe it's only fair that Berger Willingham and Howe cover the bill in full." With that, I pulled a copy of the legal bill out of my bag and slid it across the table toward Jenkins. As he began to glance through it, his face turned pale. "The hourly rate you're asking for is higher than that of our senior partners," he exclaimed, disbelief coloring his voice. Then it dawned on him. "Wait a minute. You mean you're asking my client to pay your fee? You said Berger Willingham and Howe would pay." "That was a mistake," I interrupted. "I know what I said, young man, and that's exactly what I meant. I expect the law firm of Berger Willingham and Howe to pay this bill in full." "That's incredible," Jenkins exclaimed, recovering slightly. "One law firm doesn't pay another lawyer's fees. My boss would kick me out of the office if I brought him your bill." "Not if you present it to him with this," I said, pulling out the last photo from my bag. When Jenkins looked at it, he almost seemed to have a heart attack. "This is Robert Willingham, our managing partner," he said in astonishment. "Indeed," I replied calmly, maintaining eye contact. "And it seems he shares as much of a connection with Mrs. Markham as Roger Avery does. As an active member of the Georgia State Bar Association Ethics Committee, I know that engaging in intimate relations with a client is grounds for disbarment. So, I suggest you take my bill along with this photograph to Robert and ask him to pay it immediately." With that, the three of us rose to leave. Lola sat at the table, tears streaming down her cheeks, refusing to look at Stephen as we walked past. He carefully avoided her gaze too, but I noticed the slight grin on his lips as he passed her. Richard Jenkins slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the wall, likely contemplating whether his legal career would end abruptly because of this mess. As I opened the door, I turned back to Jenkins. "One word of advice, Mr. Jenkins," I said, catching his eye. He looked like a defeated man. "Next time you ask a lady out, don't keep her waiting." I didn't allow any discussion about the day's accomplishments until we navigated the chaotic roads of Atlanta and returned safely to my office. Then, I let the celebration begin. Stephen and Emily danced joyfully with each other, laughter filling the room. I handed out glasses of sweet tea. "Emily, could you hardly contain yourself?" Stephen asked, excitement brimming in his voice. "Oh, Stephen. Did you see the look on Lola's face when Sarah showed her those photos?" "But those photographs," Stephen interjected. "How did you even get them?" "My dear, we owe our gratitude to Lucius Rayford," I replied, grinning at their bewildered expressions. "You see," I explained, "Lucius Rayford is the owner of one of the largest cleaning companies in Atlanta. His firm is contracted to clean the building that houses Berger Willingham and Howe. I simply asked him to install a couple of wireless digital cameras in strategic locations." Their eyes widened in realization. "So, you had the evidence all along," Emily exclaimed, her excitement palpable. "Exactly," I said, raising my glass. "Here's to victory and to ensuring that justice is served." As we toasted, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. We had taken a major step in uncovering the truth, and for Stephen, it was only a matter of time before he could reclaim the life he once had. As I settled back into my office, the weight of recent events hung heavily in the air. "So, what did Roger Avery's office have to say?" I asked Stephen, trying to gauge the mood. "Let me just clarify," he pointed out. "Roger Avery's office isn't on Peachtree Street." "Right," I acknowledged, "but how did you manage to get that shot of Lola in action with him?" "Lucius may not own the only cleaning service in Atlanta, but he knows the owners of most of them," Stephen replied. He didn't hesitate to ask the team servicing the Avery building for a little favor. "Interesting," I remarked, intrigued. "But how did you even know Lola was getting involved with these people?" Emily leaned in, her surprise evident. "I didn't know that either. But I became suspicious when you mentioned how quickly she climbed the ranks at Hamilton Johnson. They have a selection of top graduates for their program. I even know one who graduated from Agnes Scott. With so many talented individuals around, why was it only Lola who experienced such rapid career advancement?" That's a great question, I said, reflecting on it. But how did you stumble upon Roger Avery? I have to admit, I never would have connected the dots, Stephen confessed. It wasn't until Emily pointed out he was Lola's client that it clicked. It could have just been coincidence, but it struck me as odd that you were served court papers at his office. How could a process server know exactly when and where to find you if Avery hadn't tipped Lola off? Exactly, I agreed, feeling a sense of validation. And why was Lola so adamant about preserving Stephen's paintings, which we know are not particularly valuable? Once I pieced it all together, I asked Lucius to have his friend check for any correspondence with Stephen's name at Avery's office. At the same time, I had him install the cameras. What about that old guy at Jenkins' law firm? Emily asked, clearly curious. Oh, you mean Robert Willingham? I replied, leaning back in my chair. Hiring Burger Willingham for your divorce representation is like using a sledgehammer to kill a mosquito, overkill, expensive, and entirely unnecessary. Just maintaining that massive office of theirs would skyrocket their fees. How could Lola afford a firm like that on her salary? Plus, even though she was their PR representative, a big corporate law firm typically wouldn't take on a divorce case without unusual circumstances. Emily's eyes widened. So you started looking for those unusual circumstances? Absolutely, I confirmed, a smile creeping across my face. And guess what? I found them. Wait a minute, Emily insisted, her tone serious. Are you saying Lola started her plan long before Stephen came to your office? That means it was all in place before Lucius could set up his cameras. How could you predict she would repeat her tactics with these three men? With a glint of mischief in my eye, I replied, I was counting on human nature to play a role here. I don't understand, Emily admitted, clearly puzzled. It's simple, I explained. A schemer rarely leaves their plans untouched. They always have to do just one more thing to ensure success. The one thing she did was with Warren, Roger, and Robert. And as for men, let's just say that once they taste honey, they always want more. Sarah blushed at my words, and a comfortable silence settled over the room. I glanced at Stephen, noticing a mix of emotions playing across his face. He looked exhilarated by our victory but also burdened with an undercurrent of sadness. I wondered what was weighing on him. Don't be sad about Lola, I said gently. I'm sure she loved you when you first got married, but a girl like her loves herself more than any man. Once she learned how to manipulate others to achieve her goals, I have no doubt she thought about trading you in for a richer model. You're probably right, Stephen said with a hint of regret. When I married Lola, she seemed like the perfect woman. But now that I've seen her true colors, I'm just glad she's out of my life. It's still painful, though. Of course it hurts, honey, I comforted him. But you're definitely better off without her. Now you just need to find a good woman who will love you for who you are. Before he could respond, I added, aren't you forgetting something? Don't you have a little girl waiting for you at home? I'm sure she can't wait to see her daddy. Stephen's face lit up as the realization struck him. Oh my God, you're right. It all happened so quickly that I almost forgot. He started to walk away but then turned back to Emily, a hopeful expression on his face. Would you like to come with me to meet Anita? Emily's face brightened. Oh yes, I'd love to. The two of them headed toward the door, and as they walked to the car, it looked to me like they were holding hands. I returned to my desk, jotting down a note on my calendar to call the Dean of Students at Agnes Scott. It's better to get started now, I thought. I had a feeling I'd soon need to hire a new assistant. As I leaned back in my chair, I contemplated our day's story. In my opinion, the woman who sleeps with her boss and other men is completely in the wrong. It's unacceptable. I could never forgive that. What do you think? I couldn't wait to see the comments pouring in.